of talking about really how to protect your businesses. I always get asked that question, how do I sleep better at night? Apart from not being in the travel industry or pretty much not living, you cannot eliminate risk 100%, right? Things will happen in life and you just have to be prepared for those eventualities if they ever come to fruition. So with that, just a quick disclaimer that I always have to give as an attorney is that none of this is specific legal advice directed to anybody's specific situation. This is really a conversation. We're not representing anyone during this call. So, but that said, it's really an opportunity to talk about the items on the agenda. But if there are any other, any questions that have been on your mind or any experiences that you think would be helpful for the group, we invite those experiences, sharing those real life experiences. We have a pretty, I would say, cozy group of 20 people. So I think we can be a little more interactive versus me lecturing to you all. So with that, to turn it back to you, Jen or Victoria.
Yeah. Thank you, Chunny. And it was so great to actually meet you in person in Sedona. And, just the fact that we were able, and I think Eleanor's on the call as well, and she was at the conference too. Hey, Eleanor. Just the fact that we can go back to conferences again. But, Zoom is still useful for these kinds of events. So it's, we're lucky that we're able to get you to kind of replay what you did in person there. And I'm still sort of recovering from a thumb injury from an e-bike incident there. So, we might talk about my what kind of compensation I can get from the e-bike people. No, just kidding. But yeah, I think so. I'm Jen Fine. I'm the co-founder and CEO of YouLi. We are the best platform for organizing group trips, and we make sure that our clients have the best prepared travelers. So whatever that means for you, so whatever your legal counsel says you need. So we're the tech that you implement the recommendations you get from someone like Chunny and team. So we're going to show you a couple of those as we go along, but I think let's just kind of dive in. I think the things that we had, I don't know, Chunny, did you have a deck that you want to present, or should we just kind of go through some of the topics?
Yeah, I thought we did. Rather than do a deck, I think with this group, we would just, talk about these concepts. I think sometimes with a deck, it can make some topics even more complicated, but it's really not complicated. And I think if we talk about it in this way, it really can break down these concepts into, real understanding.
Well, I think the first one that we had is just really understanding that the terminology that's out there in terms of all the different kinds of insurance and liability and things like that. Do you want to take that away?
Absolutely. So the topic of insurance is really sounds boring and dreadful. And I always say we really need a celebrity ambassador for business insurance. Some of the insurance companies have some great celebrities, just to capture people's attention and make it a little more fun. But that said, the topic of insurance is so absolutely critical. It's hard to really understand how important it is until you're in the situation of needing it. But when it comes to insurance, it's really not complicated. We have insurance in our personal lives. We also need them in our business lives. And I put it into the category of, I like to use the acronym PPP. Everyone knows it as a Paycheck Protection Program in the United States, right? But I say, think of insurance in terms of people, property, and your profession. Those are the things you want to protect, right? So insurance isn't sort of just this one product that you just go get and don't read about. It's really a combination of products that it's on you to really understand what it is that you need and which product fits best, right? So in our personal lives, we have auto insurance for our automobiles. We have home insurance. We might have rental insurance, landlord insurance. If we go rent a car, we'll get rental insurance or not. So approach business insurance the same way. But on the terminology, two of the common terms you'll hear are commercial general liability insurance, which is CGL for short. You'll also hear about errors and omissions insurance, which is also known as professional liability insurance. So CGL is really, it protects kind of your business operations from the physical environment, right? So if you have an office, it can protect you from claims involving your office environment, your employees who are within that office environment. If you have all remote workers, CGL will also come into play to protect, let's say, if you have a lot of equipment, computer equipment, things like that. Maybe you have an employee that stores equipment at their house for activities, probably not, but let's say they do. Their homeowners insurance probably won't cover that, or you don't even know if they have homeowners insurance. So you'll want business liability insurance that covers your business operations. So that's, sort of CGL insurance. The other insurance that you'll hear about is the errors and omissions. And this really protects you in your professional capacity. And the caveat is to some degree, right? None of these insurance products covers every situation, every circumstance, every mistake, every damaging event. But just generally speaking, the errors and omissions, AKA also known as professional liability insurance, protects you when you make errors or you're negligent in doing your work. So that's really the key difference.
Does that also include, like, if somebody that you're selling to is negligent, like they do something stupid while engaged in an activity with you? Like, it's not your fault, it's kind of their fault, but it's under your care.
Right. So, and again, these scenarios are great, and they're ones to make sure are covered by your insurance, or if it's not covered, understanding that. But you can also go back to your broker to ask that. But that situation would typically play out. Let's say you organize a trip, and some of these will be variations of real life incidents I've heard about, but you have someone who is just a terrorizing everybody on the trip. You don't know what to do. And let's say they go and hurt someone or harass someone, and you get sued because of their actions. The importance of the insurance, putting aside whether or not the case ever gets to a decision where there's a damages claim, one of the key benefits of having these insurance products is they typically cover the cost of defense. I had some of these comments in Sedona when we had a discussion around insurance, is that before you even get to the point of determining whether you're responsible for another traveler harassing someone, whether or not you have to pay, exorbitant amount of damages, well before that, the clock is going to start ticking on a lawyer to defend you in court. No matter how frivolous the claim is, no matter how strong or weak, you will have to hire a lawyer and appear in court, and that costs money. Insurance products typically cover cost of defense, and that can be well into the six figures. So well before there's even a finding of liability, you could be bankrupt, right? So that's a key benefit of having insurance.
Wow. there's an incentive to get insurance.
Yeah,
I know,
absolutely.
but no one ever wants to sort of think about these things, right? But that's the nature of insurance, and hopefully it gives you that comfort so you can sleep at night. And I guess what feels kind of overwhelming sometimes is like you said, you have to get lots of different kinds of insurance, right? So one of the ones I think we had on the list was data security, sort of data protection and cybersecurity insurance, which is a relatively new product, right, in the insurance industry. So one of the things, so for example, we have that insurance obviously because we're a data platform. So do our clients also have to get that insurance to cover themselves in terms of data security?
I would say so, yes. I mean, every business that's out there that's handling customer information, that's handling, information that would be considered, that could be damaging to someone else if it got out of your hands, should be looking at getting this insurance. We have this insurance. I really, in my personal and professional opinion, I think that operating without cyber insurance when you're dealing with data or sensitive files is really asking for trouble. We've all seen the major cyber incidents, right? Usually they're big, splashy, big cases, Sony, others getting hacked. But if you look at statistics for small businesses, they're or medium-sized businesses, they're also very vulnerable to cyber attacks. Someone can come in and hack you. What's been increasing, especially during the pandemic, is hackers going in and basically locking down your files so you can't get in, and they demand money, right?
Yeah.
So the cyber policies typically will do, like, if you end up getting hacked, you're just going to feel at a loss as to what to do. Cyber policies will typically cover your business's computers, but also your employees if they're working remotely, if they're using their personal cell phones, personal laptops. Again, depending on the company, they'll cover, right? If the hacking incident originates from there. But they'll cover notification to customers if you need to go that far. They'll help you figure out, a plan to some degree. They sometimes have lawyers that are, available to at least do an initial consultation to game plan it out. If you need forensics, it will be covered. And don't think this is covered by your other insurance, right? Like your commercial general liability insurance or errors and omissions. It won't be. So you really have to have this add-on policy. But the good news is there are products out there. There are products for companies that, from small to large. And I think
what's it called again?
It's cyber, cyber insurance. One company that has done some webinars in the travel environment is called Wingman Insurance. This is not a recommendation or a referral, but I've been on some panels with them. But Wingman, WINGMANN. It may be one N. It may be one N. Yeah. But I highly recommend that. So, in terms of like figuring out what you need, I would say you definitely should be looking at commercial general liability insurance if you run a business, errors and omissions for sure, cyber, and then, as you assess your needs, you have to really identify like where are your greatest risks, right? Some companies might be, having people drive automobiles. Other companies don't, right? So companies that don't have their employees driving automobiles or doing anything like that won't need business auto insurance, but another company might, right? So it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, and on the cyber insurance side of things, it's interesting what you say about, like, usually the headlines are all the big companies, right? But the small ones are definitely, in some ways, they can be in a different kind of trouble because they're not sophisticated enough to protect the data, and so not understanding how to make sure that that the data is being handled properly. And this is one of the reasons why you work with platforms like YouLi or a MailChimp or a CRM, right? We as tech providers, we have to make sure that we comply with data security best practices and things like that. And every once in a while, we get people asking us for things like, "Oh, can we store credit cards in your system?" And I'll be like, "No." And it's one of those things like, wouldn't that be handy? It's like, yes, it'd be handy for you. It'd also be very handy for someone who manages to get into your account and then has access to all the credit cards for all your clients. And so that's something that I think sort of small businesses sometimes don't think defensively that way. They think about, okay, well, it's really convenient for me, so let me do that. It's like, yes, but that opens you up to that additional risk because if it's out on a platform or if it's out, in a digital file, it's really easy for someone else to get access to. So that's just one of those things, we all have to get a little bit more sophisticated about, sort of being defensive with where do we store our data, what kind of data do we collect, and that's its own webinar.
And I think that's a really great example, Jen, and a really great, I think it's sort of reminder that it's important to think about like allocating responsibility, right? So maybe that I don't want to be responsible for the security around credit card information. So I don't collect it in the first place, right? That's why we use payment processors who are set up and they focus on security around financial data, and they're regulated and they handle it all. So, to the extent I have any responsibility, it might be, hey, I picked a really terrible payment processor that nobody's ever used and it's some fly by night. Well, I could get into trouble possibly for that. But if I go with a reputable company, they have things in place, then I'm never in the position of having to defend what happens to credit card information, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's, one of those things, that's why we work with, big ones like Stripe and Square and various payment processors like that. I was just talking to somebody, I was dating myself. Like, you remember back when you would like go to a gas station and you would give them your card and they would like run it through a machine and like pick up the, the number on a piece of paper.
No
and then they would
what you're talking about.
All right, that's right. I'm the old one here.
No kidding.
But yeah, so, we've come a long way in terms of, securely processing, but now, it sort of changes the risk dynamic because now it's all aggregated in the cloud and it needs to be protected in a different kind of way. And I was saying that still happens in places. Yeah, I'm sure it does. And that's actually, and I think in travel in particular, this kind of stuff still happens more than in other industries. That's certainly what we've seen from our clients, kind of pushing us to like store credit card information in a way that they can, sort of charge to suppliers. So this has been one of those awkward conversations around saying, well, that puts you at risk in a way that, you can't insure away. In fact, I think most cyber insurance companies won't, they won't pay out if the reason why you have an incident is because you weren't following sort of certain data security practices, right? Because usually they have sort of clauses in there in terms of how you operate in order for that insurance to kick in. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this goes into, when you think about insurance, this is all about risk allocation and what's appropriate, right? So companies that are in the business of insurance are, they sort of they do sophisticated calculations on the expectation of a claim. But they're not in the business of just handing out money every time something goes wrong, right? Which is why they limit what they pay out for. But one of the key areas is gross negligence. And you have to look at clauses, but if you're grossly negligent, I mean, think about reckless driving or you do something recklessly. Let's say you recklessly run your operation. Maybe you are offering rafting trips and you never ever do maintenance, right? And you never ever do what you're supposed to do and you get sued. You might get coverage for the cost of your defense while the facts are being sussed out, right? But this sort of gets into sophisticated insurance concepts, but it could certainly reserve the right to come after you if it sort of comes out that you were grossly negligent. They're not going to basically let people do all sorts of like intentional things. They don't insure for intentional harm, grossly negligent harm. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and so actually on that, I would love to talk about liability waivers, because can't we just like make all this liability go away?
Yeah. So does anyone have a pressing question about liability waivers?
Well, we'll let anyone who has a question, please do pop it in there. I, of course, have one as well. My pet question. So my pet question is around digital signatures. Oh, actually, well, Christine is saying, how much can they actually protect you? And then I can ask you a question about collecting the actual waivers themselves. Oh, Anna is saying in Argentina, they are not legal. So you can't get a liability waiver at all in Argentina.
No, I think that's where we're heading into, like risk. We can inform people of the risk they're getting into, but we cannot have them sign a waiver. In fact, that can bounce back against you. It's like you were trying to get out of it. And it's not legal here. So you can only give them like a risk assumption form. But
Okay.
that's it.
Oh.
Has that always been the case, Anna? Or is this?
Yes, because any accident and that actually falls under criminal law here.
Okay.
And so there's no insurance for that. So that's why I'm doing less and less adventures and going more to wineries. People can have a heart attack, but yeah, no. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing here. Yeah.
Right. So thanks for that, Anna. That underscores an important point, which is this question about how much do they actually protect you depends on your jurisdiction, right? So Argentina is going to be different than another country. Within the United States, it will be different from state to state. You know, the nuances might be different. When they apply might be different. In the United States, however, and this is, you know, it is surprising to people who are not in the United States sometimes. But most states will uphold a liability waiver. There are a couple of states that do not recognize liability waivers, but most do. What the waivers, but there's some caveats to that, but what the waivers can do is absolve a company from negligent acts, right? You make a mistake that's within industry sort of standards in terms of making mistakes, like it can happen. It does not protect, they do not protect you from grossly negligent actions or intentional misconduct. That would be against public policy. We're not encouraging people to be, you know, reckless in terms of other people's safety. We're not encouraging people to do intentional harm to others, right? So waivers will never protect that kind of conduct or action or inaction. So it's really the space of negligence. Some states require you to specifically say that you're waiving negligence as a traveler. Some states you don't have to say that. So that's why it's important to look at each state. The caveat about waivers is that courts, it's a kind of a legal term, but they disfavor them, meaning they review waivers very, very strictly because people are giving up such important rights, namely the right to sue you for any injury that they suffer because of a negligent act of yours, okay? But in the United States, in most states, people can bargain for that, for activities that are not essential, right? So let's say, you know, the water company wants me to sign a waiver to get water to my house. No, that's an essential service. You don't see waivers for that kind of service. But for adventure activities, the way courts, the way our society and most states see it is that's optional. And if a company wants to offer you a trip at probably a lower price than if they take on all the risk, right? Like I'm bargaining for a trip that costs $2,000, whereas, you know, if there wasn't this waiver, it would be $4,000. Yeah, I'm a perfectly capable person of making that decision on my own. I'm autonomous, you know, I have clear thinking. I can go ahead and sign a waiver. And that's the status in the United States. Whether or not a court upholds the waiver, you will be put quite to the test, right? Has to be clear, has to be unambiguous. And that's why I spend a lot of time with companies, you know, a lot of times people are like, oh, do we really need to have a separate waiver? Well, it helps because if you bury it somewhere, what's the point? You're making it harder for yourself to have that court uphold your waiver. So when they work, this is the way, you know, it would happen in real life in court. You get sued in court. your very first response will be, I want to dismiss the case at the very beginning before I've spent much money on a lawyer, before I've had to open up my file cabinets, right, with all this information about the lawsuit. They sign this piece of waiver. I mean, they send this piece of paper that's a waiver. The court can recognize it. There's no dispute they signed it. The case should be tossed out from the get-go. And when it works, it's really sort of a quick out-of-court knockout. And that's what you're really striving for. The other positive thing about a waiver is it can also make it harder for someone to find a lawyer to take their case. If I don't have a really clear case, and let's say it's tough, and then I'm in a state where waivers really are upheld, then it looks like a good waiver, that person's going to have a much harder time finding a lawyer who's willing to take the case, unless this gets a little kind of a little bit into the weeds of litigation. But many times in cases with an injury, people do not want to spend money to pay for the lawyer. So usually they look for a lawyer who will take the case for no money up front with the promise of payment later. Okay. You're not going to take the case with a promise or a good chance of payment later unless you think it's a strong case. So the waiver could be something that stops a lawyer in their tracks and might say, this case is not terribly attractive to me. I don't want it because I don't think we'll win, or it's another obstacle. So there's a benefit to the waiver in keeping someone from maybe suing you in the first place.
I've never heard that perspective before. So that's encouraging that they can kind of dissuade those kinds of frivolous lawsuits. And also, I think what Anna had said is that they're also kind of a way of just informing people of the risk that they're taking on. So it's, it's not just to protect you, but it's also just be like, hey, like what you're about to do is dangerous. If this worries you by reading this document, you should probably stop, right? Does it also kind of perform that just sort of normal function, non-legal function? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So waivers have, I think they sort of a few different objectives. So at least in the United States, they can, one, serve as a contract, right? I agree to waive my claim to sue you one day in exchange for getting this trip. And that's actually a contractual defense. So the waiver is a defense I would raise as they signed a waiver. This case should be thrown out based on contract. Okay. The other defense we have is, hey, they assumed the risk. They knew about this risk and they did this anyway, right? They accepted that risk and the potential for something happening. So that's a defense number two.
And is that different? Because I think Anna's asking, would that also apply to a risk acceptance form? Like, what's the difference between risk acceptance versus a waiver?
So the waiver is a contract and it's reviewed by courts like a contract. Did the person sign it? Is it clear and unambiguous? And there's a whole developed body of how contracts were reviewed. So it is different in that when you get to court one day, and it is hard to conceptualize it a little bit until you're in court, but it is one defense, okay? So let's say the court says, not buying it, this was horrible waiver, the language wasn't clear, it's no, I'm not gonna enforce this contract against them. Then I'd go to my other defense. Well, they knew about this risk. They knew they could fall out of a raft, or they knew when they're climbing Kilimanjaro that they could get, altitude sickness and get, or there's no medical services up there. There's no hospital, right? So that defense is they knew and they accepted it. And that is different than a contract. Your waiver could have been tossed out from a contract standpoint, but from an assumption of the risk, it'd be like, well, they knew. And this gets into risk and whether you had special knowledge about the risk and they didn't. So for instance, let's say you know that there's a very specific hazard on the river. And you specify this in the assumption of the risk. Okay. And let's say they say, I had no idea that this risk was there. The guidebooks didn't say it. There's nothing anywhere. And I would say, but it said it right here in our waiver. You knew about it and you did this anyway. So that's the difference. And that's what it gives you, is a separate defense that they knew. And it's not just the waiver that you can point to as evidence that they knew. In practice, what has happened is we have the waiver perform the contractual duty, but we also put assumption of risk language in that waiver to have another piece of evidence to say they knew. But if we were ever to defend a case and talk about assumption of risk, I would be pulling out everything. Well, people know that they can fall out of rafts. And I'd point to how they would have known. I would point to the waiver. I would point to safety briefings. I'd point to everything I could to say they knew what the risks were. Does that make sense of why these are kind of two separate things?
And do they have to be two separate forms? Like, or is it the waiver itself is both potentially a contract, assuming it's done well, and also communicating the risk that they're taking on? So it kind of provides both those functions?
Yes, it's serving both functions. It's just expedient, and it makes sense to put it into one document versus two. But it's just another piece of the evidence. It's just another thing to point to from the assumption of risk standpoint. But it's not the only thing.
And so then kind of thinking about that in terms of proving that they did actually, sign your waiver, they did know, did you communicate that effectively? I think, that's something from a platform perspective, we're always trying to make sure we give people a way to clearly communicate to their travelers the risk they're taking on and signing waivers. So what are your thoughts in terms of that sort of digital? Yes. Is paper better than digitally signed waivers? Like, does paper make it more legit, or is a digital signature just as legitimate?
Yeah, I mean, digital signatures are just as legitimate. We had federal and state legislation that's evolved over 10 plus years. There's a federal act and state corollary state acts that make digital signatures just as valid as pen and paper, ink signatures. There's certain instruments that require special type of signature, even a digital signature process. So like wills or real estate documents and things like that, that have very particular requirements. But, my clients have been using digital waivers for years. I recommend digital waivers because it's just easier to keep track of signatures, easier to find a signed waiver. I mean, I can't even imagine going to a filing cabinet to find somebody's waiver, or like worrying about stuff burning up in my attic. There go my waivers. If I didn't make an extra copy and secure it somewhere. So anyway, but people are using digital waivers. There's nothing to be afraid of with that.
And I think I see Katie is actually asking, in terms of waiver signatures, do you have a recommended platform? I know there's so many digital signature platforms. Is there a difference?
I think you just have to look, there's pricing differences, to start. But most of the digital signature companies have a clear, explanation of their digital signatures, how they're able to sort of connect a digitally signed signature with the IP address, right? Because that's kind of the ID of people who sign waivers, is their IP address. But they should have like kind of a documentation process for that. Should you ever have to go to court and they just have to testify as to the signature process. But I would say a lot of popular, and I won't recommend a specific one, but there's several out there that companies use. There's Waiver Sign, Disclosure, their client, Waiver Sign, Echo Sign, hello sign. There's a host right signature. So it's
Smart
a
waiver. Yeah.
smart waiver, like take a look. I think it's just, which ones are you comfortable using? Make sure you understand how they work. And look at their pricing, because that might ultimately be a factor for some.
And then one of the questions that we get a lot in terms of on our platform, so that's the signature platform. So that's assuming you want them to like actually do like that sort of signature process, and there's a whole process around that and how long it gets stored and all of that kind of good stuff. But within our platform, we have a mechanism when you register for a trip to collect consent. Right. And so there's that sort of checkbox that kind of appears on that registration form. And that's actually it's not a liability waiver, but it's, usually that's the place where you kind of communicate your privacy policy, which is a different kind of thing, right? So it's just saying like, this is what we're going to do with your data. Would you, at the same time as they're sort of registering, would you also, would you also use that to communicate like terms and conditions at the same time? Or is that something you would do sort of later in the flow? Like, do you mix it together because they're just going to check the box and probably not read them anyway? Does that make it less enforceable or less legit if you put it there? Or is it just good practice to kind of put it in front of them a few times in the process?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. And it really depends on jurisdiction, right? As to whether they're going to uphold the check mark of the terms and conditions, or whether you should combine all of this together. Some companies like to present the terms and conditions at the same time that they present the privacy policy. I think a good number of companies prefer to send out the terms and conditions and get the signature, the digital signature, along with the waiver. Some companies split that process up, meaning that they send out the terms and conditions with the waivers shortly thereafter. For anything that's really important, like trip information, cancellation terms, I don't think you're going to want sort of a quick check the box. I tend to think that terms and conditions, and when we're talking about terms and conditions with like all of the good information about cancellation, about what's required on a trip, that people should have time to review that, sign it, right? And you get a signed copy.
Yeah, and I think that's, so then on that point of like a signed copy, so we have seen some of our clients use these signature platforms, which obviously there's a lot of them, so there's a use case for that. But we've started to see some clients who are actually just doing a digital signature on a YouLi form. So I'm just going to show this to you and just kind of give this as an example, so that people kind of know the distinction on this. But it's sort of on the task, actually putting it, just writing it all out. So this is the limitation of liability. And then actually just saying, by typing your name below, you're digitally signing this document as you would with your own signature, with the date. And so kind of making it so, yeah, it's not an actual, like they're drawing their name, but they're typing their name. So what are your thoughts about whether or not that is any more or less legitimate than sending them off to a waiver sign platform?
Yeah, I think, this gets into that. We had this discussion, Jen, about assent. So there isn't, like, under the law, a specific form of agreement to a document. There might be there is some case law around like how you do things electronically, right? Like, do you have to scroll down? But putting that aside, the pure question of, can you just type your name? You can certainly type your name, or do this signature. I think people have just, as we've moved over into electronic signature, companies have adopted the practice to actually kind of sign your name, even though it looks nothing like your handwritten signature, and probably all of your digital signatures look different depending on what platform you use. But you can certainly sign that. How this works in litigation is someone would have to come in and say, I didn't sign that, which they could do with paper documents, right? And I would say, well, it says here by typing your name, you're agreeing to this. I could say, we're going to install a camera in your living room, and if you jump up and down 3 times at this particular moment, and we're going to capture that, that is an assent. And that could be an assent. I'm just using that kind of wild example to say, you can show your agreement in different ways. Some ways might be harder to actually prove up when you go to court. But, there isn't sort of this one way to agree to something. There are practices you can put in place to try to increase the ability to refute anybody saying they didn't sign. So here, I think you can certainly have someone type in, and, we do a lot of business with where we type in our signature without actually signing.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make sure that there's time for questions from our participants here. I know a few people kind of joined in a little bit late. Hey, Allison, good to see you on.
We have a question about working with partners, and that's actually a question we had offline too. If I'm hiring a supplier in a country and it's outside of the US country, right? If I'm running a trip outbound, can I specify that the agreement is governed by the laws of the US? If not, is there a language that would cover international clients?
Okay, so this is a US-based company that has clients from other places. And yes, you can include a clause, and you should include a clause that specifies what the location where any disputes must be brought from a geographic standpoint, and also what venue they can bring a case or dispute. So sometimes we have companies want only arbitration, right? So if there's a dispute, you have to go to arbitration, and you have to do it in New York City. I could specify that. Or I could say, if there's a dispute, you could bring it in federal or state court in the District of Columbia. Many times I see agreements that don't have what we call a venue clause, or a location where the dispute must be brought. And that just leaves you open to someone filing somewhere. And you're going to really have to make the case for why it should be in the United States. Just because you include this language in a contract, let's say specifying a jurisdiction and specifying the law that must apply, people can still refute it. But it's a much better situation to go in and say, hey, look, this person agreed that they can only bring lawsuits in this particular location, or they can only go to arbitration. And you just need a court to agree with you there. But you're in a much stronger position to at least have it in a contract.
Great. That looks like that answered Glenn's question. Were there any other questions?
Yeah, another question I was trying to Rubin, it's like, this is regarding the customers being right outside of the country. What if your partner, the ground partner, is outside of the country, and you're hiring them to provide that part of the service in the trip?
Right. This is something that's negotiated in your supplier agreements. This is something where it really, you can put your location, and that's a starting point, right? So if you have a contract that you want to give to a supplier, you can say you've got to come to the US. But the supplier can certainly push back and say, no, it has to be in my location. And that's really a case-by-case situation. When I work with clients, we really just, kind of balance that out. some companies are like, I'll go where my supplier is. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of that. But when it comes to your travelers, you want to specify your location. And there are a number of reasons for that, which is, first of all, any sort of intense litigation, you're going to have to like show up in court, right? Or depositions. So if you're a business owner or not a business owner, but you're running a company, you want it to be in your backyard, right? So you don't have to get on a plane and fly off to someplace. There's also, we think of home court advantage. You're going to have an advantage if you're the defendant in litigation in the location where you are, right? So, any sort of big company like the Florida cruise lines, believe me, they want to be sued in Florida, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they have relationships. They contribute to the economy. The legislator, the lawmakers certainly don't want to make them mad. So law over time develops that's more favorable to them. I mean, it still tries to be equitable, right? But there can be procedural advantages. There can be a host of other advantages. So those clauses are super important. And one thing I want to mention, if I can, I think we were going to touch upon like trademarks and infringement. So one of the add-on coverages that you can get, or it might be included in some of the policies that are out there, involve advertising injury. So if you're sued for trademark infringement or copyright infringement, there is a type of coverage that can kick in, which is called advertising injury. And in the travel industry, there's been a lot of cases involving infringement claims over images. That's a whole other topic to get into detail about. But having the insurance coverage, if you ever get sued for that type of situation, is worth having. I think it's an essential.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point. This is one of the things as a platform. So we make it possible for you to upload your own images, which we encourage, because if they're your own images, then you have the right to use them. And we also integrate with Unsplash, which has free license to use those photos. But there's other platforms we've seen that connects to like Google Images and allows you to just like randomly grab any image you can find on the internet. And we've specifically decided not to do that as a platform because it just opens you up to thinking you have the right to these images when you probably don't in that case.
Absolutely. And I can't stress enough, like how many companies end up calling me saying they've gotten some nasty threatening letter from some stock photo company or some photographer who's after them, is demanding thousands and thousands of dollars. And these people are relentless and they have a system in place and they will just, keep sending you correspondence and calling you. And that's because there are some strong protections for copyright in the United States. And there's some strong protections in the law, including damages. So if someone has a registration for an image and you've copied it, it's a strict liability defense. Meaning you can't say, I got it from my web developer or the Google search engine allowed me to find this. That is not going to fly. It's like, is it a copy? Did you have permission? No, done, pretty much. That's simplifying it, but that really is kind of how it works. And under the law, typically when you're sued, people have to prove up damages, right? So whether we're talking about bodily injury, whether we're talking about some other form of harm, you have to show damages. When it comes to copyright infringement, it can be tough, especially if it's an image that no one can see, but it's on your server and a bot can find it, and you can end up getting a letter because of this, saying, nobody saw this, or it's a really bad image. Again, they'll say, well, Copyright Act says for every infringing work, I get $30,000 if I can't show the harm I've suffered. Basically, under the law, there's something called statutory damages. And someone who's had their image infringed can choose between lost profits, or they can choose the statutory damages, almost like taxes. Do you want to take the standard deduction or do you want the itemized? And it depends on whether the itemized is higher than the standard, right?
Right.
So if I'm like, I don't know, I haven't really been, I don't know what the damage is, but hey, that $30,000 is looking pretty good. For willful infringement, it's $150,000. And they will shake these figures around at you and just scare you to death. So I just say, you know, call a lawyer in that situation or talk to an industry colleague who's been through it, but get advertising injury as part of your coverage.
That's a good tip. And don't use images that aren't yours.
Yeah, but it's really, you know, I would say this is an area that can get tricky because there's a lot of image sharing. So we've had situations where they can play out a number of ways. One is an intern goes and gets images that, you know, I say, go get something that's free and clear without much guidance. And they go and get something that says free on the internet, and it's not really free. Somebody just said it's free, but it's someone infringed it. There's that situation. There's a situation where you as a busy business owner outsource it to a web developer to go get images, and you don't ever have the discussion about ownership, and then you get dinged and you can't find this web developer, right? They're gone.
Right.
They don't have any money. And then the third could be a destination provides your company with images, or one of your partners supplies you with images. All of those situations have happened.
I'll bet. Oh my gosh. So the fun thing about these conversations is it's a never ending conversation. But I know that can always be a little bit intimidating for business owners. But I feel like, you know, it's pretty clear that the insurance that you laid out at the beginning, you know, the core insurance that you need, and then obviously, you know, talk to your lawyer to find out what extra stuff you need, and make sure that your waivers are actually contracts written well, and get the right advice in terms of, you know, how do you collect that consent? Like, is the way that you are collecting those waivers and the way you're collecting consent, is that going to hold up, right? If it is challenged, you know, and so when you're picking your platforms, like you're picking your waiver platforms, you know, make sure that they're, you know, documenting it in a way that you can use in court. On our platform, when they check the box to register and consent, we document exactly when they did that, and what they agreed to, so that you can go back and point at that if there ever is a dispute about whether or not they consented and what they consented to. So, you know, there's all these little pieces there, and you know, but as you say, we can't make the risk go away. We can only sort of manage it and be aware of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think in the pandemic times, everyone's worried about people contracting COVID on a trip. And my view is we can try to reduce that possibility, but there's a very good chance that someone will come to a trip with it, or contract it, and you just have to have things in place to deal with it. But like, you just have to give yourself a mental break from feeling like you could be the super person who could have prevented it from happening. It just, you can do, you know, you can put steps in place and it would still happen. So, so I think that's the thing, is just take steps, put these things in place. They're all solvable. There are resources for every single thing we've talked about, and there are people who can break it down and, you know, put those things in place. It could be a mini size, it could be a major size, but just get some sort of system in place, and you know, you'll feel much better just knowing that you're protected.
That's how you can sleep at night.
Yeah.
Nice circling back, guys. Like, it's like we started from that. How do you sleep at night? This whole webinar was about that.
And I think Katie had just a comment here about creative risk management plan, which is super important, and insurance is a piece of that plan.
Well, I think we've run out of time and covered a lot of really great topics. Do want to shout out, thank you, Chunny, for joining. Please reach out to her if you're looking for personalized advice. ATTA has been brought up a number of times. If you are a member, go to the hub. There's a lot of resources there to use. And Katie's also online. She helps adventure travel companies put together those kind of risk management plans. So if you're looking for some assistance there, get in touch with her. So yeah, as Chunny said, there's so many resources out there so that you can continue to plan your adventures and sleep well at night and know you've done all the right things. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks Chunny so much. It was so good to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone, and good luck with everything, and hope to see you all in person at some point somewhere. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye guys.